So we're going to start off. If you're not familiar with the basic ideas of the French, please look at my other videos, namely the French Advance variation. Covers more of the basic ideas. So this is a little bit more advanced, not too advanced, but just I'm not going to explain everything, spell it all out. So we'll start with the E4, obviously, and we get into knight C3. And today I'm covering the classical. I can cover some more variations later. This, I mean, if you read a lot of repertoire books, I think Anand wrote one, and I think Kashim-Janov has done a series or something about this, saying that this is the best way for white to play. And it may be. I'm not entirely convinced that it's the end of the world. I think black can play fine against this, and some French players like the winnower with the bishop out to b4. I'm not a fan of that. It's un-French-like for me. I think it's too theoretical. So I'm recommending we play knight f6. This is the classical French. If you like combative play, I don't know why you'd be playing the French anyway. If you want a wild position, just play the Sicilian. I don't understand that. But anyway, that's just my opinion. And here's the classical. The other option is for instead of bishop g5, white can play e5 here, and that's the Steinitz. I'll cover that later if people want. So I'm covering bishop g5 here. And this really is an interesting way for white to play. There's some players who play this craziness. I think this is utterly bizarre. Although it's easier to play, I guess, from black's perspective in some sense, but white's going to take, and I think one of the main recommendations, I'm sorry, that's a mistake, take with the bishop. And you're supposed to play g takes f6 or some nonsense. Maybe a player far, far stronger than me would be able to explain why this is so advantageous. The obvious reasons are it opens up some files, but remember, we're playing for solidity. If we want wildness, we'll play a different opening. So the recommendation I'm giving is bishop e7. And what is our key concept in the French is very simple. We want our dark square bishop. Our pawns are on light squares. We know our light square bishop is going to be bad. We're under no illusions. And here we're pretty much voluntarily giving up our dark square bishop. And it's a little bit sad because white's going to play e5, knight d7, and we're going to have an exchange. I'll cover another variation where white plays h4, which is very interesting. And we're at the key position in the classical French. What to say about this? For the exchange, we've got a well-centralized queen. And it's a tough situation to give up this dark square bishop. Some players don't like to, but I think black has good reason to do so. The main move here for white is f4. And I'm going to first cover an interesting sideline, knight b5. And it's just good to know that white can play this, and it's actually quite interesting. At first I thought this is a quite bad move, but it turns out it's actually quite playable. Our response is obviously knight b6. He's threatening to take on c7. We have to prevent that. And c3, this, if white plays anything other than c3 here, it's not a good idea. Then this move was bad. So if they play c3, otherwise we'll kick the knight, it'll go back, they lost time, and we'll probably just play c5. So c3, I'm recommending to play a6. We kick the knight, and you're going to see a similarity here to the knight a3 advance variation. It's sort of like they tricked us. This is why I found this quite a clever attempt by white. And I would if you're a white, if you play e4 and you play against the French, this is definitely something to consider. They've actually forced off our dark square bishop, and they've gotten their advanced French without it. And I don't think it's much better, because we have some interesting ideas ourselves. c5, knight c2, and now this is the point. White is coming back and holding on to d4. And we're going to play our main move, knight c6. And f4 is the best response here. If instead, knight f3, we're going to castle after bishop e2, play f6. This is our standard play. Again, if you're not familiar with this, please view an earlier video. And so, obviously, if white takes and thinks that they're going to gain something by this, maybe winning a pawn, we have this beautiful move, knight a4. And this, in the books or in the database, has not been played very often for black against this. So I think if you play this, they will have definitely not seen it. b4 is out of the question because c3. We're hitting, obviously, b2 and c5. They're losing material, and I think black has got an excellent game. Nice central control. And instead of knight f3, they can play f4, and they're trying for this very, very aggressive space-grabbing strategy against the French, and we're just going to castle. After knight f3, play f6 anyway. So just keep this in mind against this weird knight b5 move. Don't expect it to be your normal French. And here we're just going to do a very similar thing. We're going to eventually take on e5 and get some very interesting play. So back to our main line after queen takes e7 and f4. Here in the classical French, white generally castles queenside. And usually if he doesn't, black's going to be okay. And black needs to watch out for a couple things. It's not as easy to crack at this center as it is in the advanced when I showed you the advanced variation, because this f4 really gives e5 a big bonus. So black has to be a little bit more patient, definitely, and realize that you're still going to play c5 and you're still going to play in the center, but it's not going to crack down quite as quickly as maybe you would hope. So after f4 we castle. It's always a sensible idea. And knight f3. This is, you're going to see this most of the time. White's just developing the knight, getting developed, and we waste no time with c5. It's important to note that we don't necessarily want to play c5 here, because knight b5, it can be a little bit more irritating, and if he gets in, we're leaving open the d6 square. So for instance, if I play c5 right away, knight b5 is actually quite annoying, because this check is going to be he's got an extra tempo, and I don't have any way of preventing it. So it's important not to get too excited about playing c5, and just go ahead and castle and then play c5. And now you might wonder, well, why can't he play knight b5 anyway? And he can, but it's just, it looks a lot worse than it is. We play knight c6, and we're just letting him go where he thinks he is good. Most advanced players won't go for this. They realize it's not anything special, but a 1400 or 1500 who doesn't know much would try this and think, wow. They always say if you get a knight on the 6th rank, that's worth a rook or more. The only downside is the knight isn't staying on the 6th rank. So it's an illusion, an optical illusion. After f6, the knight, and please note that if the knight takes on c8, we're very happy campers. The bishop is actually just in the way. So we're not worried about that. And after c3, which is the only move to keep the knight there, otherwise we'll take right on d4 and then take on e5 and sack. And it's all she wrote. So c3, f takes e5, f takes e5. And here's where the magic starts happening. We're going to take on d4. Knight obviously cannot take because the pawn on e5 will hang. C takes d4, and here's the magic. Bam! Rook takes f3. And I doubt your opponent will be expecting this. But if queen takes, we have knight takes d4 and other very interesting possibilities. If the pawn takes, need I say more? I mean, does this look like a position you'd want to play with white? I don't think I would. After that check coming with the queen, it's going to be sheer disaster. The d4 pawn's going to fall. e5's going to fall like ripe fruit. It's going to be game over immediately. So we have no fear of this naive attempt at bringing the knight in. So hopefully white's not going to be so foolish. Well, we don't mind it, but hopefully for their sake they won't. Queen d2, and this is bringing in that main theme. Queen side castling. And that's why I say this position is hard. It's sharper for both sides. It's not just hard for black, it's hard for white because they're asking for it. And hopefully, you know, we'll be prepared. Knight c6, standard developing move, not much explanation needed there. And here I'm just looking at the case where white takes. And this is the most common move, actually. And in the advanced French, I said that this is a bad idea. But here it's not such a bad idea because e5 is so well protected. And there's two crossroads here for black, and that is to take with the queen, and a lot of players play that, but I slightly prefer taking with the knight. And the reason is the knight frees up the square for the bishop, which once we get the bishop developed will allow our rooks to move around. It also avoids irritating moves like knight a5 hitting the queen, knight a4, I'm sorry, hitting the queen if the queen was on c5. So it's interesting. I'm recommending you play this, and white's going to castle long. If white were to play bishop e2 and then short castle, black is going to be fine. Because white's whole plan here, the whole reason they did all of these moves is to play on the king side for a king side attack. So if they're kings over there themselves, they obviously are not going to be able to do that. a6. Now we want to prevent the knight b5 possibility because it could be a lot more difficult to get it out in this situation, even though that's not a huge threat right away. It's mainly we want b5, b4, a5. That's our goal. We're standard kingside assault with the pawns, and the main move here is bishop d3, and it could be very tempting to take that bishop with the knight, but be patient. Better than taking with the knight, which is actually a good piece. Better than that, we want to trade off our light square bishop for that bishop. And you might ask, how on earth will we ever manage that? It's going to be very difficult. It's going to take forever. Well, not really. We play b5. And just as an aside, I think I included a variation with knight takes d3. And the reason it's not so great is queen takes. Now the queen's involved. f5 is rearing its head. So if you play a move like knight b4 to hit the queen, just queen e3, and f5's coming, everything's held down, and the knight's not doing anything over there. So it's this, we want to stick with our plan. The knight should be attacking the center, and white's really getting what he wants. He's going to be able to push his pawns very quickly, and once f5 comes, d5's a problem. We have to worry about f6 coming. We don't necessarily want to take. So just beware of that. Just keep the knight where it is. It's a good piece. don't automatically assume that just because the bishop looks good that you should trade it off, and you're going to see why. And at the end of this, I should have mentioned this earlier, I'm going to show you an illustrative game using this position. So we are in the main line, and king b1, which is the safest move, just getting the king on a little bit safer square so that he's not vulnerable to checks. And what I mentioned here, b4, and this is the other reason I like knight c5. Knight takes c5 instead of queen takes. White doesn't have the option of knight a4. So, you know, I really think that's a nice bonus. Although it's not clear he would want to play it. Still, nice to have that out of the way. Knight goes back to e2. Okay, clear, obvious. a5. Now, and really, I don't know why White would go in for this position. It seems that Black is doing just fine. Our pawns are very well advanced, although White's been smart and not made any pawn moves, preventing us from being able to attack anything, you know, right away. And if White isn't careful and doesn't get on the bandwagon here and start playing some aggressive moves, and you'll notice all his moves so far have just been developing and moving pieces on the queen side. But that's where our strength is. And where we are clearly weak is on the king side, and he has made no moves over there. And this isn't some side variation. This is the most popular variation in the classical French. So you just take a look at this. I'm going to show you the rest of the moves, but I would rather be Black. So knight comes in to d4. Makes sense. Wants to try to get a good centralized piece there. We're obviously going to take. And here's the reason we didn't take. Now we're following a game by Akopian, and if you put this game into a database, the game by Akopian will come up. Bishop a6. This is why we didn't want to take with the knight. We're always looking to get that knight, that e5 square. We want it more than we want to take the bishop right away. And once the take happens, we play into knight e4. And Black's better. There's no doubt about it here. And we've got everything. The best piece in the world, the knight. Our pawns are well advanced, and here we can see after knight e2, and why play this? Well, it's clear White's attempting either to bring the knight back to protect the king, or to trade the knights off. But of course Akopian gives him no time with b3. And after takes, and queen takes, queen a7, knight comes back to protect. Need I say more? White resigned. And this is, look at how, just keep track of how White never even got going. He didn't even get e5 in. He didn't even get no weakness on the black side. All three pawns perfectly in front of the king. The white pieces are corralled around the queen side, attempting to protect this wide open king. And this can happen very, very easily if black plays these really, really patient moves. And that's this knight takes c5 business. Let's just review after f4. Castles, c5, queen d2, knight c6. And we've covered this variation where white takes. He doesn't always do that, but it's the most common. And a6, b5. This is going to be the most common position you'll reach if your opponent plays the classical. And follow this game by Akopian. I cannot for the life of me remember who the white player was. He was a 26 or 2500 player. just enter this game into pretty much any database should have it. And B4A5. Needless to say, I think right here, black's doing quite well. And this is the way you should. This is a good model game for you to approach the classical French, and hopefully this video was reasonably helpful for you. One last note, if you're still watching, if you have games that you want me to look at, I will be more than happy to do that. I won't promise that I will do a video on them, but if they're instructive and something that I can, really talk about, I will definitely do a video, and maybe I'll compile some games together, and maybe cover a couple games in one video. So hopefully you enjoyed this. Thank you very much.